Welcome, friends. Very glad that you're here joining us for presentation number 9 in our Heroes of Faith series. And we have one more tonight, and that's going to be talking about the sign of Jonah. Now, this morning's presentation is going to be a little bit unusual. It is based on a Bible story, but I'll be taking a major detour through history. And the title of the presentation is The Unsinkable Ship. But as we always do, these are rooted in Bible stories. And so we're going to be going to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, verse 22. And this will be the story that will be the springboard for our study today. Luke chapter 8, verse 22. And now it happened on a certain day, actually at the end of a day of teaching, it was toward evening. He got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, "Let us cross over to the other side of the lake." And they launched out. But as they sailed, he fell asleep. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water and were in jeopardy. And they came to him, and they woke him and said, "Master, Master, we are perishing." That must have been some storm, because these were well-seasoned fishermen that had spent their lives on that lake. And that evening, in the dark, as they were crossing to try and get some peace and quiet on the other side, a tremendous supercell developed in the hills above Lebanon, and it caused a storm, and the wind in that part of the country can race down from those mountains to way down below sea level, and it is one of the very unique pieces of topography that is known for sudden and very violent storms. And this storm built up the waves from almost nowhere, and their little ship was being bounced all over the place, and water was starting to come in, and they couldn't bail it fast enough, and they were afraid the next wave was going to swamp them and send them down to the bottom. The sailors were scared. And then the lightning flashed, and they saw Jesus was in the boat, and they'd forgotten all about him. He was so exhausted, though he was drenched, he couldn't wake up from his teaching and ministry through the day. And they called out and said, "Master, Master, we're perishing." In one version it says, "Do you not care that we're perishing?" Which is a strange question to ask Jesus. Then he awoke, looked around, surveyed the elements, rubbed his eyes, and he uttered one word in Hebrew. It says, "Peace be still" in Greek, but all he really said was shalom. And as soon as he said that, the wind ceased its raging of the water, and there was a calm. Another part says a great calm. As soon as he spoke, the waters became flat and glassy. There was a great still, and it was so much so, he says to the disciples, "Where is your faith?" And they were afraid, and they marveled and said to one another, "Who can this be? For even the wind and the waters obey him." Now they're even more afraid after they see his power of speaking and turning the storm into a great calm. Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? You know, the Bible is filled with stories about boats in the sea. Matter of fact, the Bible begins with a story about a storm and a big boat. You've heard of Noah. And then as you go through the gospel stories, several stories with Jesus on the sea, the New Testament ends, the book of Acts ends with a great storm where Paul ends up being shipwrecked. And of course, we've got the story of Jonah. The Bible has a lot to say about storms. You maybe heard about King Jehoshaphat. He had a whole fleet of ships that went down in a storm. Just about a week ago, when Hurricane Joaquin went through the Bahamas area, it's almost hard to comprehend that here we are, 2015, and you got a vessel 790 feet long, the El Faro, and it just disappeared with 33 lives. Even with our modern technology today, we have not learned how to completely tame the elements of nature. Probably one of the most amazing stories of maritime disasters is the Titanic. Because the Titanic represented really a change in a lot of things that were going on in the world. It was a change of an age. Now, some of you may or may not know that there was a book written. There's many movies and books about the Titanic, but there was one book written that was similar, but it's really about a different ship. And it was written by a merchant seaman by the name of Morgan Robertson. Robertson wrote a book called The Wreck of the Titan. And he wrote his book, The Wreck of the Titan, 14 years before the Titanic was built. Now listen to some of the very interesting things from Morgan Robertson's book called The Wreck of the Titan. And you tell me if you don't think this is uncanny. First of all, the name. The book is called The Titan. Titanic and Titan come from these ancient giant Greek gods. Same name, really. His book, his fictional story, was written about the largest English ocean liner that had ever been built, that was crossing the Atlantic in April, struck an iceberg and sank, had the most elite people of the age on the boat. The length of the Titan, in Robertson's book, was 800 feet. The Titanic, 882 feet. The width of the Titan, 90 feet. Titanic, 92. The Titan was the fastest ship that had ever been built. Like the Titanic, it could go 25 knots. In reality, the Titanic could only go 23. They said that the Titan was unsinkable because it had 19 watertight compartments separating the sections of the ship. The Titanic actually had 16. Both the Titan and the Titanic had 3 propellers. The capacity of the Titan, in Robertson's book, was 3,000 people. Titanic, 3,250. The number of people that were actually on board during the disaster, 2,000 on the Titan, 2,228 on the Titanic. They didn't have enough lifeboats on the Titan. They didn't have enough lifeboats on the Titanic. Only 24 on the Titan, 20 on the Titanic. About half as many as they needed. They were both sailing in the North Atlantic and sank, hitting a pyramid-shaped iceberg that overturned 400 miles from Newfoundland. And isn't it incredible that they were both encouraged to break speed records? Both happened in April. And the story, The Wreck of the Titan, was written 14 years before the Titanic was built. The amazing thing is that Morgan Robertson took the book to several publishers, and the editors said, "We're not interested." And he kept saying, "Why not?" They said, "What you've written about is too unbelievable. It would never happen." But we know what happened. The Titanic really did happen. You almost wonder, was this some unwitting prophecy? The Lord was trying to tell us that about the futility of his trust in his own technology. Well, when the Titanic sank, it remained missing for 75 years. Then back in 1985, the search I think began in 84, Dr. Robert Ballard was crisscrossing across the Atlantic in a grid, pulling some sonar equipment to try to locate the wreck, and they were dragging a camera across the bottom of the ocean when suddenly into the view came this picture. It wouldn't look too attractive to you and I, but they'd studied every facet of the Titanic, and they all squealed and were jubilant because they knew right away this was a boiler, one of the many boilers on the Titanic that they were looking at. And as they continued to pull the camera a little further, then the bow of this once majestic ship came into view. These are some of the early photographs that were taken. Many have gone down to the site of the wreck. Ballard made several trips there. Matter of fact, I've got a book signed by him at home. I think he's seen my presentation on this. And he went down in some submersibles, 13,000 feet, 2 miles down, incredible pressure, very dangerous to go to. In preparation for the movie The Titanic, James Cameron made 30 trips going down 13,000 feet to the actual wreck, taking pictures and preparing for that epic film. I started actually preaching about the Titanic before they discovered it. I was always sort of interested in, as I said, not only flying, but the ocean. I lived on an ocean when I was a teenager in the Mediterranean and another one in the Caribbean, and just always been very interested in the sea. But they wanted to find out exactly if they could confirm what had happened with the iceberg by looking at the wreck, and they found that the boat had broken in two, and the sections were separated by 1,900 feet. It had actually totally split in two, which is interesting when you think about it, because when the Titanic was built in Belfast, Ireland, it was built in record time, and it was deemed to be unsinkable. 3,000 men were involved in building the Titanic. It was actually built by White Star Lines. It was part of 3 ships that were built: the Titanic, the Britannica, and the Olympic. And when it finally made its maiden voyage, that April in 1912, a little more than 100 years ago now, it was called the Millionaire Special, because a lot of the leading millionaires and stockbrokers were on the ship. You've heard of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, built by the Astor family. John Jacob Astor was on the ship. And you've maybe heard about the unsinkable Molly Brown. They made a movie about her. Molly Brown, the silver mine heiress from Colorado, was on the ship. Astor perished. Molly Brown survived. They had all of the most beautiful design and elegance for the age put into the Titanic. This is the grand ballroom. It was the central piece of the ship, and beautiful dining rooms. And they had some of the best wood engraved from all over the world. It was a piece of art. It was like just the greatest artisans, and all of the elegance of an era were incorporated. Yet they had some of the most modern technology. If you were to imagine today a ship that incorporated all of the technology of the U.S. space station, they had all of the most modern technology that had been poured into this one vessel. They had swimming pools, and they had beauty salon, and they had barber shop, and they had gymnasium, and now that's sort of state of fare for any cruise ship, but it wasn't back then. These things were considered luxury of the luxury back then. And so there was a great bit of fanfare that gathered at the port when the Titanic took off on its maiden voyage. Reporters were all there. The ship had been advertised as being unsinkable. Now, you have to go into history, and you'll find different myths that are written about the Titanic. One person said that the captain of the ship, who was John Smith, that he was overheard saying when a lady asked, "Is it true that the ship is unsinkable?" that he had said, "Madam, God himself could not sink this ship." Another version say the good Lord himself could not sink this ship. So there's been some ambiguity about what was said, but one thing is certain, that White Star Line wrote, "We place absolute confidence in the Titanic. We believe that the boat is unsinkable." Hence the title for the message. A White Star promotional flyer for the Titanic claimed, quote, "As far as it is possible to do, these 2 wonderful vessels," then it was the Titanic and its sister ship, the Olympic, "are designed to be unsinkable." And in another quote, Captain Smith said, "Madam, you could cut this ship in half and both sections would float." Because it was designed with these watertight compartments that spread across the ship, 16 of them, and there were electric doors. They would press a button if there was an emergency, and 1 or 2 or 3 of the different sides of the ship had been punctured by a mine or torpedo. They would press a button and close off these massive gates, seal the leak to one section of the ship. The remaining buoyancy would keep the ship afloat until it could limp off into port and be repaired. Captain Smith said, "I cannot imagine a scenario where this ship would founder." There was one lady, she was actually the mother of one of the last survivors of the Titanic. They've all perished now, everybody that had been on the Titanic. Some lived to be over 100. Last name was Wolf. She overheard the interview, and she thought this was a very bad omen. She had trouble sleeping. She felt like that the builders of the Titanic were shaking their fist in the face of God and daring him to sink the ship, and it made her very uncomfortable. She and her infant daughter survived, but she couldn't sleep. She just felt like something ominous was going to happen. Titanic was also a boat, for some reason, they often name and christen a ship. But they never christened it. Not that there's any special value or religious significance to that, but it was just unusual. Usually when they launch a ship, they christen the ship, but White Star Lines did not do that with the Titanic. So off it went. Beautiful weather, making its maiden voyage, traveling from England, made one stop up in Scotland, and then headed across. Some of the only surviving photographs are people who took the short trip from England to Scotland. They got off, and they had taken some pictures, and that film has been recovered from some of the tourists then. And as they were making their way across, Captain Smith, because he was planning to retire, he had served White Star Lines 40 years, he had never had an emergency at sea, and matter of fact, he described his career as a very uneventful one. He wanted to go out with glory, and they gave him the honor of captaining the ship on its first voyage, was going to be his last voyage. He wanted to break a record. He wanted to break the record for crossing the Atlantic and go out with a blaze of glory. And right there, when you're trying to make a name for yourself, pride often goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. This boat sort of symbolized the arrogance of the age. They had put so much trust in the industrial age that they thought that they had gotten beyond the point where even nature could bring down the ship, and especially in such beautiful weather. I'll share with you a few amazing facts as we proceed, but one that's interesting. Titanic was the only ship in recorded history that was actually on fire the entire time it was in service. Just before they launched, a fire broke out in one of the electric rooms, and every time they tried to open it to attend to it, it flared up again, and so they just closed the door to rob it of oxygen. And they never did get the fire out. It was small enough they could isolate it and still operate all the electric needs throughout the ship. But it was on fire the whole time that it was in service. Now, today, they wouldn't let it continue operating like that. Another interesting fact, and you can look at the picture, I think it's on the screen, is while it had 4 smokestacks, the last one in the rear was a dummy. They wanted the ship to look symmetrical. They were so consumed with making a statement that they built. It did have a little air vent in it, but it had no smoke going out. It was a big dummy stack to try to make it look even. So if you ever see movies and stories where you got smoke coming out of all 4 stacks of the Titanic, they haven't done their research. They also had a modern communication system. It was a Marconi wireless. And that was how the ships would talk back then. They couldn't talk, but they used a type of Morse code to communicate. And as they were making their way across, the wireless operators were very busy because all of the millionaires and all these wealthy people in the first class section were sending greetings to all of their friends, and they would relay them through the different ships, or as they went by Newfoundland, they would relay it to the station there. And they would check their stocks and please send greetings. And, this was a first-class vessel. They had to try and get it all out. And there were stacks and stacks of message that the wireless operators were using, trying to tap them out to accommodate all of the millionaires. Well, the man who was at the station during the fateful hours on the 14th of April was Jack Phillips. And he was frantically tapping out those messages, and some of the operators from other ships, like a ship by the name of the California, said, "We have encountered icebergs. As a matter of fact, we have stopped for the evening." The captain told us to stop because we've run into a field of ice. Another Russian boat wired the Titanic, and they would wire their location periodically. And they said, "Based upon your location, you are moving way too fast for the ice that's ahead of you. You need to slow down." And so they received several messages that were saying, "We know you guys are rip-snorting across the ocean trying to break a record, but you need to be aware that there's a field of ice." And the Russian freighter said, "There are 2 very significant icebergs." So it wasn't just the small broken ice that they could plow through. There were some big icebergs that could seriously damage the ship. So they had received these warnings. At about 11:40 that evening, the radio operator on the California, they could see a faint light of the Titanic off in the distance. He radioed and said it was the 6th message that they had received that day about ice ahead. He radioed and said, "You guys better slow down because there's ice ahead, And Jack Phelps radioed back to Cyril, who was the radio operator, Cyril Evans, on the California, and he said, "Please shut up, I'm busy." Well, he thought that was so rude. Even though he was supposed to stay on duty until midnight, at 11:40, he turned off his wireless and took off his headphones. Moments later, the Titanic struck the iceberg, and they began to radio for help, and nobody was listening. You know, there's a message in there. God often, through our lives, sends us warnings. But we're often so preoccupied with doing our own thing and our agenda, we're not listening to the voice of God. And it's possible that you can grieve away the Holy Spirit. Little by little, the volume goes down. God is calling us, and we ignore Him. The Bible says if we turn